Hi, this is Peter Teuscher. I'm here with Tobi Demker. Thanks for joining us for another podcast where we pick a topic and see where the conversation takes us. We talk about personal development and professional development, a little bit of philosophy, and let's hope we can really engage with people today on our topic that you've chosen today, Tobi. But I think before we get into it, any afterthoughts for last week? Last week we were talking about clarity.
Yeah, I was thinking a little bit about it, and it's just that in this, well, the situation where the world is today, how difficult it is to get clarity. Everything seems so muddled in terms of, well, just with business, the looking at the stock market, looking at, of course, the geopolitical situation in the world. It's also muddled, so it's really difficult with clarity. I think that's what I'm kind of wrestling with. I reckon.
Yeah, actually, for me, I was last week. I went to visit with. I had some work to do in Scotland, and then I visited with a friend and colleague who I've done some work with in the U.S. And anyway, we had a really good. This is the great thing about knowing lots of coaches is
Mm,
when you need someone to talk to, and our conversation gave me a lot of clarity because
mm,
I'm a person that I try and do a lot of things at once, um, and she really helped me get clear on the fact that if I if I don't focus, I'm not going to get a lot of quality on on the things that I do. So
mm,
anyway, for me, having a good person to talk things through without people trying to give you advice or just kind of affirm the things they just want to be nice, and so they want to tell you what you want to hear. I think
mm,
it's really good to have that kind of person that will give you give you give you some honest reflection on
mm.
situations. So
Yeah.
so I gained some personal clarity last week, which is good.
That's great, and but I mean, that's also a reflection for me. I think in times where I feel like I don't really have anything to focus on, I'm also a person that I need deadlines. I need to meet deliverables and stuff like that. If I don't have that, if I'm not busy, it's that can be create a lot of diffusion for me when I'm not finding clarity because I don't know exactly what to focus on. I do a little bit of that and I do a little bit of that, and it's not really helpful for me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, because I've been trying to work on this book, and she really put it a good question. She said, are you really going to get this book done by writing a half hour here and there?
Mm,
No, obviously not. And I do have some longer sessions, but yeah, trying to juggle things. I think you have to dedicate yourself if you want to have the clarity and the quality of your work come through. I think
yeah.
that makes a huge difference. If we both know that multitasking is not a real thing. Your brain
Mm,
tries to switch between things constantly, and so makes you less productive. So, and certainly if multitasking is a lifestyle, it's you may think you're getting a lot of things done, but the quality is going to suffer, and so
mm.
is your stress level.
Yeah. So I think we have another topic for another conversation. I thought we could talk about commitment sometime. That would be
Yeah,
really interesting,
absolutely.
actually.
That's another that's something we could explore for sure.
Mm.
I think on that note, on getting organized and focused and all that, you've got a business related topic we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, I guess so. Okay, so I chose the topic of meeting management today, or just, well, let's say meetings, or structuring meetings, or meeting effectiveness, whatever we want to call it. And it's not so much on the individual development part; it's more on the professional development part, perhaps. But I think it's really interesting. For many reasons. I mean, regarding time, but also nowadays when we spend so much time in meetings, of course, and especially in this virtual setting. We spend so much time in our virtual meetings in this environment, and how do we really value that time? How do we make sure that we are effective not enough in that time, and what does that mean? So there's a lot of different perspectives that we could bring into this, but it's really about, I mean, if you look at statistics of how much time that is wasted on meetings, and now I'm not talking about virtual meetings, just meetings in general. If you look at, I was looking at a few different studies of this, looking at both organizations, but also regarding GDPs or for companies or for nations,
Mm.
and the amount of resources that are wasted in ineffective meetings is really quite staggering. And I think all of us can relate to this, and that's why I think it's interesting that we're sitting in meetings sometimes and we're wondering, what am I actually doing here? Why am I in this meeting? What am I expected to bring to the table?
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, that statistic doesn't surprise me at all. Like understanding the amount of waste that goes into poor use of meeting time, it doesn't surprise me. And I've got two examples that come to mind right away. I was working on a project last year, and there was one woman I was trying to connect with. I had access to the company's calendar, and I could see that she was just full of meetings all day. And I wondered, like, when do you have time to do physical work, because you are in meetings all the time? So she was probably working every evening, and then because every day was full of meetings. And then a few years ago, I worked with a guy who just, anybody who was remotely relevant to the topic would be invited to the meeting. And that clearly didn't make any sense either. So yeah, I totally agree with you. I've experienced it on so many levels, and there's just, it's not really that hard to put together an effective meeting and to have some ground rules. And it amazes me how few people stick to that kind of a process.
Yeah, because it seems like we're getting into, as human beings, I guess we like routines, and we create these routines about, okay, we just have to get this done, but we don't look at that process of how we're actually doing it or how we're effectivizing it. So, and this morning again, I had another training where some of the participants were saying, yeah, I have back meetings from 8 to 5 the whole day, and they were realizing during the training, like, how am I going to take time to reflect on what we're doing in this meeting, and what are the outcomes of this meeting? You go from one meeting to another, but you don't even have time to take care of any of the results or the outputs or something. You're creating work, but you don't have any time to do it, really, right? So
no time for preparation and no time to follow up
yeah.
after. So I totally agree. It's I mean, there's no way you should 100% of your day should be meetings. Naturally, there are exceptions where you have these full day meetings, and then you have the coffee breaks where you catch up on emails. But in the same way that you shouldn't be spending your whole day working on emails, your emails, you have blocks of time where you can set aside for emails, and then for all those other things. And the meetings are the same. I mean, anyone who is just filling their days with interacting with other people without putting time aside to either do the follow-up or to engage with your own activities, you're just going to, it's going to be a black hole, right?
Yeah. Yes, I think we can try to agree on some basic kind of principles or behaviors. I think you've mentioned a few already. The first thing that I want to start with is what we started when we had our first coaching conversation, or our podcast conversation. The first topic was about purpose, right?
Yeah.
So
why are we meeting?
Why are we having this meeting? What are we here to do? What's the purpose? What are some of the objectives? Of course, the purpose and the objectives should be aligned, but having a really clear purpose of why are we having this meeting?
Yeah.
And I think, now this is an assumption that I'm having, but I assume that in many times, if we really ask ourselves that question, we don't need to have the meeting.
Exactly.
Could it be better for me to call a person and have not a meeting, but just a conversation with one or two people, and then can solve this kind of issue? We don't always have to create this platform. We're getting into this routine that we need to call and invite a lot of people. is that the most effective thing to do at all times? I don't think so.
Yeah. So I think the first point, I think whoever's leading the meeting or whoever's organizing the meeting needs to be clear on what the purpose is. And so if it's something like, well, it's not a meeting to update everybody on a project, well, then don't have that meeting.
Yeah.
You summarize that in an email, or you send out a memo and give everybody an update. But to have, unless you're working in a Scrum type process where you have these stand-ups, these quick stand-ups, and you have different iterations. That in itself is a process. But for the most part, just to have a meeting just to update everybody. Why are you bringing people together? I think is a good one, and clearly it's important to make sure that you know who's called the meeting, who's organized it, who's going to take the lead and be responsible for the agenda and the outcomes, and circulating the minutes. I think that's really important. But the other thing is, what's the alternative to meetings, right? When you're trying to ask a question or get a consensus or get everybody on the same page. And so we've got all these different different ways of, like, Slack is one, obviously, but or Teams, or these different ways of communicating. And I find, so I agree on the meetings front, but then you find there's these huge threads of conversations that you've got to read through everything. Like, let's say you haven't been following it, and there's a conversation that all of a sudden blows up on and there's like 20 entries, and you're trying to follow the conversation. So obviously that's not ideal either. So if the conversation digitally is starting to get really complex, then that may be a sign that it's time for a meeting, right?
Yeah, sure. But then maybe the purpose then is to clarify, what's going on, to get everybody to on the table.
Yeah.
And that can be about answering some questions, or just raising issues, or looking at perspectives and sharing information. So what is the meeting for, and what is but then you also mentioned how much time do we allocate for it? Do we, and that's something that I've learned that is very helpful in this virtual setting. How we schedule our meetings. Typically we schedule them for an hour, but more and more I think people are scheduling 50 minutes. So at the end because we usually go by the hour kind of thing. So if we schedule 50 minutes, we make sure that we have 10 minutes to take the break, to reflect, to prepare, to capture any thoughts, or take the bio break, or whatever is needed. But so we're not on this treadmill of just running from one meeting to the other all the time.
Can I make one comment on it's so funny, that term bio break, because I think it's in non-native English speaking countries, because in Germany they say it a lot as well. And I know from working in Scotland and Ireland, people will say take a natural break. Or in North America, I think it's similar. But it's interesting. Is that a Swedish term?
I don't know. I guess it's just in the training world. In Sweden now.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but I've heard it multiple times. But I've only heard that term in working with Germans or non-native English speakers. So anyway, I was just curious. Maybe I'm poorly informed, because there are things I've never heard of before when I first went to the UK. Just different vernacular. It's different colloquialism. So anyway, it's sorry to digress. Sorry to get off topic. But you're right. No. It's important after a meeting to have time to do whatever needs to be done.
Yeah. Simply put. But then also, I've heard of people who only schedule 15-minute meetings. Right. So 15 minutes, is that enough? If we can't solve the issue, or if 15 minutes isn't enough, then we have to schedule another meeting. But just and that can be one way to effectivize your meeting as well. Of course, it always depends on the context, but that goes back to the purpose. What is the meeting for? Yeah. But I think it's really annoying when you have a really big issue that you have to take time to discuss, and there's just way too little time to do it, that's going to have a very poor output as well.
Yeah.
So
I
really balancing that timing.
Yeah, the time constraints can be under the right conditions can be really helpful. It really forces you to come to the point. I mean, if you're talking about complicated things that need a lot of input, obviously, if you need to have some kind of discussion and debate, that's not reasonable. But if you're doing like a Scrum type process where it's a stand up and everybody gives their a quick update, 15 minutes could be perfect because
Yeah.
people aren't going into the long drawn out stories about things. They're getting right to the point. And I know coaches who will do they'll do 15-minute power coaching sessions, right? And it'll just be one topic, and we're just going to go stay needle focused on that. I've even done that, although I prefer to have a full session. But sometimes if you have a client that wants an accountability, someone to be accountable to, and you're doing a weekly 15-minute, that can be really effective. And I think you can take that same kind of mentality into the workplace, where it's like, is this a friendly? How much time are we going to spend just a friendly chat, building rapport, and then we only talk about the topic for 5 minutes, and the rest is just kind of gossip from the office. I think those are recognizing what the content of your meetings has been up to now. And just to go to the point that I was mentioning before on the guy that used to invite anyone who was anyway remotely could remotely have an interest in the topic. I think it's important when you talk about purpose to talk about to think about, okay, what is the relevance of the topic to the people that are attending, right? Because time, I think why this topic is so important, because time is our most valuable resource. And we waste a ton of it.
Yeah, and exactly, it's not our time only that is on the table as well. I mean, we're talking about all of these people's times, and everybody's busy and have a lot of different things to focus on. And obviously, you see in a lot of meeting, these behaviors are that I'm sitting in the meeting, but I'm actually working on something else. So do I need to be in this meeting? Would it be better for me so I could focus on my thing and then get updated later, or whatever needs to happen? But I think it's really important to just create some, or have some time to prepare your meeting, so you're thinking clearly about the purpose, the timing, and who should be invited. And then the next step would be, what are your expectations on the people that are invited? So what do you want to do? They need to prepare anything, or how do you want them to behave, or how are you going to behave? And then that brings me to the sort of common or the shared behavior kind of aspect of things. And this especially for reoccurring meetings. That how often do you look at that process of having meetings? So how do you evaluate your meeting? Are they being effective? How do you decide how they are conducted? What roles are going to be played in the meetings? Now, just looking at that, looking at the how of meetings, looking at the process. So what does your decision-making process look like? Do you vote, or is it always the leader or the host that decides? And what kind of behaviors do you want to have in a meeting? Is it important to hear everybody's perspectives, or do you really listen to each other? These kind of the common values actually of the organization or the team, how are they reflected in your meetings? Because this is the platform where you have the opportunity to communicate, to share ideas, and to really be together. So how are you being effective in this during this period of time?
Yeah. So there are a lot of points there. I think that when you talk about behaviors, it's a reflection of the culture. So I think there are, been in the corporate environment where there are very different types of meetings taking place. And, when this is why it's so important to have an agenda and an understanding of what you expect the outcome to be. And for some organizations, the meetings are great. People come prepared. There's just the right amount of chit chat to have interaction to make it a comfortable atmosphere. And then, people have well thought out points to bring to the table, and they ask good questions. And then at the end, there's a wrap up, and people share the outcomes. There are actual decisions that are made, and or at least next steps that are decided upon, and those are great. But then sometimes meetings can be this forum for a jockeying for power, for people to try and show off what they know or try and establish themselves and play political games. And I've just seen all kinds of power dynamics, on display at meetings, and that just has no place. I mean, that just makes no sense, and it's a reflection of poor culture, right? So you can, the type of meetings you have and the type of environment is a good place to look when you want to understand, well, what's the, anytime groups of people are interacting with another and you can observe their behavior, it's a good time to evaluate your culture.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think that's why this is so interesting, and maybe particularly for people like you and I who work with different organizations, and this is our window into them. So looking at that culture, this is where it's exhibited. So we see how people behave during meetings, what's working well, and there are huge differences between different organizations, and that can have to do with culture, or natural culture as well. I mean, the Germans are always on time, the French are always late, etc. But I think I really agree to that point, that why it's important, but this is where you set the organizational culture.
Yeah.
That this is where the opportunity to exhibit the behaviors that you want to see, and try to avoid the ones that you don't want to see, right? And if we're not being effective, I think this is really interesting as well. I mean, it's common sense, but if we're not effective with our meetings, what does that lead to? Well, it just leads to more meetings. So we're in this vicious cycle of just creating more and more meetings that are being non-effective. So I think it's so important to be able to take that step back and look at, well, do we need this meeting, and how can we be as effective as possible? I don't think we're going to get it, but how can we become more effective with our meetings? And that's where that part of evaluating and looking at the process comes in. So how often do we do that? Do we take time to reflect on our meetings, ask for feedback? Do we do a proper checkout from the meetings to ask, okay, so how did it go today? What could we do a little bit more of next time? What should we focus on? How can we improve? Because this is a forum where each participant needs to be active. It's not only from the host, right? So allowing a little bit of time for that discussion as well, and that can be a part of a checkout process or whatever.
Yeah, and I think there's different types of meetings for different occasions, right? So,
sure.
Obviously, if you're having a business review, or you are, in the middle of a project and you need to go through some clear, like you need some clear decisions to be made. But the kind of meetings that happen quarterly or annually, thinking about ways to get the optimal kind of participation out of meetings is really important, because, I think this is where the whole understanding the audience, or the audience, or the participants, because depending on the industry, you can have really introverted people, and let's say if you have a group that has different departments coming together, and you've got, I don't know, IT and finance, and then marketing and sales, you've got a wide range of people that are from very extroverted to quite introverted, and you're not going to, if you don't facilitate well, you're not going to be able to get everyone's opinion, or the most important and valuable opinions. You're going to get the people who are the most outspoken. So I think when you're a facilitator of a meeting, those kind of dynamics are really important to consider. And I think especially when you're looking for maximum participation, maybe even some form of creativity and brainstorming, I think using like an open space kind of concept is really good, and allowing, there's some situations where you absolutely need a very clear agenda, and then there are other times where it's important that people have time to contribute to the agenda, whether it's in advance or during. So for anyone not familiar with the open space concept, it's a very democratic way of running a meeting. Obviously, Toby, you know this because we've run these kind of sessions with people. But it's people will put all of their. You can get Post-its, or you can find ways of allowing everybody to put topics that they want to discuss on cue cards or on Post-its, and then as a group you decide on how you're going to fill your day with those various topics, and the person who's posted it needs to be able to lead that discussion, right? And so it allows everyone the opportunity to contribute to what are the things that we as a group think are important. So that the whole democratic process. So that's just one modality, one process that can be used. But whenever you're looking to have a creative and brainstorming type atmosphere, I think, or trying to get at the heart of, well, what do we need to be talking about? Because sometimes, if the department head is a very finance oriented person, they just want to talk about the budgets and the numbers, and really maybe there are some interpersonal issues, maybe there are some customer related issues that are going to get overlooked because it's all about the numbers, right? So I think those are just a few things to consider, and in the ways that you're going to facilitate a meeting and the way you can structure the flow of the meeting.
Yeah. And also that brings me to think about, because we've talked about psychological safety before, and the importance of having that balance, or having, psychological safety as a really as a key concept in your meeting. How can you ensure that the participants in the meeting, that they feel comfortable with speaking their mind, that they're actually being listened to, that they're able to share their perspectives, and that they're feeling that their perspectives and input is being valued? I mean, obviously, as a facilitator or a host, you have an important role to play here, but also setting that foundation with all the participants. Because I think I'm thinking back to some meetings that I've been in where some participant is saying something, and some other guy is sitting at the other part of the table and just like looking into the ceiling and just sort of sighing and thinking that this is not important. Yeah. These kind of behaviors are common, right? So how do we highlight that this is not acceptable if we want to be able to create this kind of psychological safety?
Yeah, well, it starts with leadership, right? So I think having some rules of engagement in meetings is important, but as a leader, leading by example can be important. And I give you a really bad example. I was this was years ago, and I was in it was a budget review meeting, and I was actually presenting and to the CEO and a few other people, and the finance director asked a question, and the CEO didn't even let me answer. He said, yes, he mentioned the person's name. He said, yes, that was a stupid question. And then, moving on, talk about the opposite of psychological safety. So, there was it's maybe sarcastic. But it would intimidate anyone if the CEO is saying, hey, that's a really dumb question, let's move on. I think, if you feel like there are always going to be times when it's a long day and, people are getting tired and frustrated. But you can always approach things with a question, right? So if there was some degree of frustration at the ignorance of a question, but look, you want people who don't understand to ask, especially a finance director. I want them to ask the so-called stupid questions, even though there are no stupid questions, because clearly if there's not a fundamental understanding of what's trying to be achieved here, there's a need for clarity. But I think asking questions what are you trying to understand there, or just trying to clarify what position their question is coming from, rather than putting them on the spot, or even doing that in a break. I think I think that it's just too bad when people in the leadership role, especially someone leading a meeting, doesn't have the strength of character to make sure that those kind of rules are followed, and that because you're not going to get the best outcomes if you don't have, as you say, the psychological safety, and if everybody doesn't feel empowered to speak up, because we both know from Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions that if you don't have that trust, right? If you don't have that trust in order to have those conflicts, then you're never going to have the commitment and so on. So I think that's a super important point. And then I think as anyone leading a group or leading a meeting, to ask themselves, what's the level of trust in the room? How can I facilitate that? How can I develop more rapport between the participants? I think those are important questions, especially if the feedback from the participants is essential to the outcome.
Yeah, definitely. And on that, I mean, also to bear in mind that it's not only about feeling safe and having fun and feeling cozy and warmy fuzzy feelings. That's great, but we also need to think about that other angle of accountability and motivation. So also making sure that we are with the objectives in mind, what is it that we want to achieve, so that balance. I think I've certainly been in meetings that are really, really comfortable, having a lot of laughs, lots of fun, but not being very productive. On the other hand, there's this balance of really focused on the results, but if I don't understand, I don't dare to ask that question, and where I'm feeling a little bit more in the anxiety zone, perhaps. So that balance. And I was just I just realized I was talking to another colleague earlier today as well. Who he was running a meeting that was going over for 2 or 3 days. Actually, it was a cross-cultural kind of issue, but he was conducting this meeting, and he was asking, what do you think? And he was really engaged, and he had some other colleagues that were really engaged. And then on the 3rd day, they asked some of the other guys, so, well, what do you think? And they were like, well, about what? They've spent more than 2 days in this meeting, and they really didn't spend the time to check in if everybody was on the same page, or they were trying to, but they didn't get their response. And perhaps it was a cross-cultural issue of saving face or whatever it might be. But it's how easy that can be neglected if we're feeling that this is going really well, but how can we be sure that everybody's on board and that everybody's understanding and seeing the things in the same way? And then when you finish the meeting, how can you be sure that everybody agrees on what we have agreed? And I think especially in a virtual setting, that doesn't always happen, right? Oh, I'm late, I have a next meeting I have to run out, or someone's at the door or whatever. So how do you finish the meeting, and especially in the virtual setting? Now, what have we agreed on? What's going to happen now? What's the next steps? Who's going to send out the minutes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right?
Well, who's going to do that stuff should be, I think, in my view, cleared beforehand. A lot of those things, but I think that's another confirmation of why it's important to make sure that you've got the relevant people at the meeting, because when you talk about motivation and engagement, right? If you've got people who are, who have something at stake, if you have stakeholders in the room and you have, people that are very engaged with the topic, you're going to have a productive discussion. Whereas if you have people that are just kind of there to listen, they could be a distraction. That's really not something that needs to be there. And I think if you have these meetings, and I really look, I'm a person who likes to be face to face. I really see the value in getting together. But if you're doing it frequently, like these meetings where they're just there to inform, I think you really need to pick and choose when you're going to do that, because I think sharing information and then having a follow-up Q&A in person could be more productive. Depends on how delicate the situation, because sometimes putting stuff in writing doesn't bring across the right nuance. But when you're just trying to convey factual information and give updates, I think the sharing of the information, keep it to the very top line, and then allow enough time for questions. I've sat through meetings where it's just been death by PowerPoint, and it's just been a whole bunch of one-sided sharing information, sharing details, and then really, I think if you're going to have that kind of transfer of information, you need to not only set the time aside for questions, but you need to find ways to encourage people to ask questions, right? So including, ahead of the meeting going, this is the kind of, here, we're going to share this with you. This is the kind of feedback we're looking for, so that people go into it already looking at things critically, formulating questions they may have, and so on. So I think that you need to have, the reason to get together is to have dialogue, interaction, and so on. So if you're having a meeting that's just purely a transfer of information, then there's other ways to do that, right? I mean, that's
for me, that's a presentation. And sure, a presentation can be a part of the meeting, but a presentation does not equal a meeting. Right? So again, think about the purpose, what's the best kind of platform for this, and what you're probably looking for is some kind of interaction with people. And I always try to have that assumption that people that are in the meeting, they want to contribute to the meeting, they want to be engaged in the meeting, but either it's me or something else that is stopping them from doing that. And it might be that I'm talking too much, or that they're busy thinking about something else, that they have other things that are more important at the moment. And maybe then it's a bad time to have the meeting.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, you can develop things in a culture where, and I've known team people who having a team meeting who will say, so, they'll ask someone, so what did you think about this? Things that are relevant to them, right? Not just trying to put them on the spot like a teacher in the classroom, picking out a pupil to make sure they pay attention. It's thinking about who's your audience when you're putting your presentation together, and then having those people that you've had in mind as you put together the details, asking them, did you understand what I meant there? Or I'd really value your feedback. And you only need to do that one or two times in that group, and then people start to realize, there's feedback required. My input is valuable. My opinion matters. I think, and again, this comes back to developing that kind of meeting culture, right?
Yeah, definitely. One more thing that I just realized as well, that I think that a lot of people do in meetings, and again, depends on how much time you have in the context, but is to do a check-in for your meeting, just to create that kind of awareness that, you might have situations where one participant is really preoccupied with someone else. And if you're aware of that, then a certain amount of a behavior that you don't want to see in the meeting might be acceptable. So, right? Well, if you're, for instance, let's take an example that you don't want to have phone calls in your meeting, right? But if you have someone who's has a child in the hospital and they're waiting for a very important phone call, that you might have some empathy with that in that situation. So it just doesn't have to be a lengthy thing, but just give everybody the opportunity to check in. This is what's going on for me right now, whatever it might be. But just so they're, if they're not fully engaged, at least they have some understanding of why.
Yeah, and I think obviously there's some ground rules where where you have phones off and laptops closed. Is the thing is you can appoint one person to take minutes, right? So that we'll share it with the group. And I'm a big believer in pen and paper. The thing is, people inevitably, and I've seen this, at 90% of the meetings I go to, people will be doing an email here or there. They'll be, you won't have the full engagement or attention. And so those ground rules are important. But again, anyone who's leading these meetings, it's developing this culture where there's an element of trust, psychological safety. People feel their values, their opinions are valued, and you're trying to engage people. I find, and I do this myself, right? I get so involved in what I'm presenting, the material I'm presenting. You forget to check in with the group, check the body language. Are people? Do people look engaged? Do people look like they have a question? That can be really helpful when somebody goes, you look like you have a question, and they may go, oh, no, it's nothing. But at least the group knows that you're interested in, and you're connected with them. It's not just a one-way kind of communication where you're just, but you know how it is, right? You get wrapped up in your topic, and you've trying to remember all the things that you wanted to communicate, and then you somehow are in your own world and forget to sort of watch the participants. And so I think in meetings, especially when you're giving a presentation, that's something to be really aware of. It's different when you and I, when we're facilitating a workshop, because you're constantly looking for feedback. And there's little bits of information, and then you engage, and then there's bits of information. But and if you could do meetings more like that, I think you'd have more engagement, and you'd probably have more productive outcomes. And I think the one more note I want to say about that is people try and pack too much stuff into meetings sometimes, and this is why understanding what you want the outcome to be. But if you're, how many meetings have you started? It's like, okay, well, we've only got this amount of time. We've got a lot of ground to cover. Well, then if you don't think you're going to cover all the points, with the level of quality that's needed, then have another meeting or put something aside, prioritize. But, what does that say about the things that you didn't get to, right?
Exactly.
Does it mean they weren't a priority? Well, then why were they on the agenda in the first place, right? And then maybe it's something that's important to someone else, and you've basically said, well, that doesn't really matter to me, right? It's those kind of signals that you're giving through the actions you're taking in your meeting that are important.
Yeah. And that's, now you're triggering some other thoughts as well. That's actually a real warning sign if you have the same thing is coming up on the agenda over and over and over again.
And you don't get to them.
So we were discussing this last week or say 6 months ago, and it's still on the agenda. What does that tell you? How do we move on with stuff, and actually taking some time to acknowledge and celebrate that, okay, we've ticked this box now, let's celebrate that we finished this. Now that's done, let's move on to the next thing. I think that can also be an important thing.
Yeah.
And regarding what you just said about facilitation and taking on that kind of role in meetings, I actually read an article about that. When looking at the effectiveness of virtual meetings, it seems like the best or the most effective sort of role to take on as a host there is to take a facilitator role, or what they call to have a steward mindset. To just, how can you serve the conversation? How can you serve the process or the dialogue? So it's not about as a leader in a meeting that we have to take on all the issues or whatever, but really to host the platform for the process to move on. Of course, you can be part of setting the objectives, but then really allow for other people to contribute and get out of their way a little bit.
Absolutely. I think, learning it's a real art to learn how to run good meetings and to lead and facilitate good meetings. And I think that's the essential part of it. So if you're often a participant in meetings, it's, giving your feedback. If you are in these meetings and you roll your eyes at another meeting, they're always the same, and you're not giving that person any feedback, then
yes,
it's going to just keep repeating, right? So again, if you want to develop an atmosphere of trust in your organization, you need to be able to put yourself out there, make yourself vulnerable, right?
Mm.
And give someone some feedback, maybe not in front of the group, but pull them aside and go, look, would you like? I find giving feedback the great way, if it's unsolicited, is to first ask, would you like some feedback? I had a few thoughts on the meeting, and wanted to share my thoughts with you, or wanted to see if you were on the same page. There are a lot of good diplomatic ways to approach that kind of thing. But if you are unhappy with the way that meetings are running and you're not the facilitator, but you're still not giving any feedback, well then, you're going to sit through a lot more of those, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love that. I mean, because I think that all of us are spending time in meetings, and we're hosting some, but we're participating in most, perhaps. So what are we constructively doing to improve the meeting effectiveness? I mean, all of it. It's not up to the leader or the host to do that all the time. Of course it is, but I think it's everybody's business, right? To take your participative role of being constructive in that sense.
Yeah.
And that's why I think this topic is so interesting, actually, because it's a part of our daily lives, but we don't really take the time to think about it, and to be a little bit more effective. Small things that we can do that can have a really big impact on not only our meetings, but then also what the effects of that might have to a happier working environment, to a more effective culture, to a healthier workplace. It goes on and on and on. There's a lot of rings on that water, I think. So I think it's just such a good starting point for things.
Yeah, absolutely. And it'd be an interesting experiment to make meetings optional and see who shows up. Have a stretch of time just to see how effective your meetings are, and go, okay, well, here are the meetings, you're invited, but it's optional, and then just see who comes and who doesn't, and then look, it's obviously a lot of people don't have the time. It's just a kind of a thought experiment that just kind of came to mind. I wonder, how many people would show up, and them showing up or not, what does that say about the way you facilitate meetings and the level of engagement? And then with a slimmed down sort of audience, how much better was the engagement? What were the outcomes more productive? I mean, I just wonder if it's tough in your day to day to run these kind of experiments, but it was just a thought that came to mind. So.
Yeah, well, that would be an encouragement to experiment, to try something.
Yeah.
Try something different, and if that's it, you can try that.
Yeah.
Whatever it might be.
Yeah, absolutely. So, did you any other? I think we've covered a lot of good ground here on meetings. I mean, for you and me, this is the thing when we cover topics that we've been doing for years, and you think that everybody's always heard it, but then still the meetings aren't being done that way, and so clearly it bears repeating.
Well, there's always room for improvement.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
I guess that's where I'm coming.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think that's. I'm happy with that. Perhaps we could just conclude a little bit. So if we want to share any tips or tools that we think is good practice, do you want to start? What would that be?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously preparation is key for meetings. And for me, the preparation is, having a clear agenda, making sure you've got the relevant participants, and have your content well prepared. Understand what the outcome is that you want to have in the meeting, and as you say, what your expectations are. I think those are all really, really important, especially what are you trying to get out of the meeting, because that says a lot about how you can structure and facilitate. Again, there's a big difference between brainstorming and having something creative, or, sharing outcomes and wanting some feedback. So I think those are all really important. And as we said, just being able to engage when you're, being a leader, and we can, we do a lot of leadership coaching. I think there are a few places where leadership is more important than in meetings. And so make sure that if you're a facilitator, or you're a leader in a group, that that you're making sure that leadership really comes through in those meetings. Mm-hmm. And if you're a participant, make sure that you're giving feedback where it's needed, or at least offering it.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I think for me, obviously, I think you captured that well. The one thing that I would add to that, or maybe it's not adding, but just like having that as a tool or a tip to make sure to have a check-in and a check-out process. Doesn't have to be a lengthy one, but a check-in to make sure that everybody's here, everybody's on board. But then during the checkout process, to do some kind of evaluation of how did the meeting go today? Is there anything that we can do differently next time? What should be the focus of the next meeting? You can do a rating. How would you rate the effectiveness of the meeting today on a scale from 1 to 10? What do we need to do to push it up a number next time? Or even ask the participants to rate their own behavior. How do they can keep it for themselves, but if you would rate your own participation in the meeting today, what would it be? How could you raise it to next time, to give away a little bit of accountability to the participants as well?
Yeah, if you're going to do an evaluation process and you're in an organization where you meet multiple times a day, that may be a little bit challenging, but you could do like a weekly or a monthly, probably weekly is best because it's fresh in people's minds. How were the meetings that you had this week? You can even have like sort of, what was the highlight meeting of your week, and then find out who facilitated and ran that meeting, right? I think those are things that you can do. So I
was thinking more about reoccurring meeting, with sort of once a week, or maybe bi-weekly meetings or something like that.
Yeah, if it's your team, then
it depends on the context.
Yeah, absolutely. If it's a little bit easier to do if it's your team. And I think I really want to impress upon anyone who's in a leadership role listening that these meetings can be a real good barometer for the culture in your organization. The way your meetings run, the way the outcomes they have, the kind of behaviors that you see, it's going to be sort of a little sample size of what your company culture is. So I think that's something to be very aware of when you're saying the meetings are dysfunctional or aren't working well. Then there's something about your culture that's probably not quite right either. So anyway, I think that's an important one.
Just the last thing there, to experiment with different types of meetings. So do you have stand-up meetings? Do you have what do you call these whiteboard meetings where you're standing at and drawing stuff or putting up magnets and stuff? I forgot the visual board kind of meeting. Yep. Or do you need to be sitting down? There's playing around with different ways of conducting the meetings as well.
Yeah, so you've got your presentation and then a Q&A. You've got kind of an open space where you've got a very democratic process about the agenda and the content of the meeting. I think there are there's roundtable discussions. But letting people know that what type of meeting it's going to be going in is really important, and then that way people can come prepared, right? So good. Yeah. All right, I think we covered a lot of ground. I hope
that was fun.
I hope people listening found the tips helpful. For us, they're kind of they're very familiar, and both from coming from the corporate world and also as a trainer and coach. It's amazing to me that people still, that some of these things are surprises and are new to people. But anyway, I hope if it hasn't been new, I hope it's been a good reminder. And remember, time is our most valuable commodity, and so the way you run meetings is going to make best use of that resource. So, so I guess we'll wrap it up there.
Yeah.
All right.
You'll choose an interesting topic for us for the next.
No, I've already got one in mind.
All right.
All right. Thanks everyone for listening. I hope this has been valuable for you. Again, if you're looking to connect with either one of us, we'd love your feedback or your suggestions for topics that you'd like us to cover. Tobi's reachable through LinkedIn, and I've got my website, peterteuscher.com. And until next time, thank you very much. Be well, take care, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks.